Hey everybody, Kevin Crouch here with South Metro Weather, and I'm with somebody that really doesn't need an introduction. I feel like I almost have to introduce myself to you, but Dale Hansen, legendary sportscaster with WFAA Channel 8 for many years, as you mentioned too, Channel 4, which back in 1980 was the CBS affiliate, just to kind of show how things have shuffled around a little bit.
A lot.
Yeah. And just wanted to sit down and take a chance to chat with you a little bit about how weather has impacted your sportscasting and your coverage of sports events. I mean, it's North Texas, and so you're going to have a little bit of everything all the time, everywhere. I mean, we've had that this season alone, and sports usually being outdoor events because you didn't have the AT&T Stadium with the roof when you were doing your thing.
And we didn't have the Rangers ballpark either. I like my games outdoors. I mean, for the most part, I really don't like indoor baseball. Indoor football, I've somewhat gotten used to over the years, and indoor baseball as well, if it's a really good stadium, which the Rangers, I think, have. But for the most part, I like the games outdoors, unless, of course, the weather does interfere, and many times it does. The cold, I don't like watching games when the teams can't do what they normally do. When the weather actually impacts the playing of a game, that always bothered me a great deal. Occasionally I kind of like it when you see them sliding around in a snowbank, in a football game.
Yeah.
But I don't like a lot of rain in a baseball game. I don't like freezing cold and high winds in a football game. It's weather plays a huge role in sports.
And on that note, can you talk a little bit about, and this is something that I like to watch, this is something that I like to think about and kind of see how it plays out when you have high winds or something that actually calculates what the coaches do and how the players play and how they approach things. So what can you speak to as far as those kinds of calculations?
One of the best examples of this was the Cowboys were playing Philadelphia, and it was so it would have been what, 95 or 94 season, Barry Switzer's first year as coach, and the game was tied with just a little more than 2 minutes to play in the game. And the Cowboys had it like 4th and 1 at the 20-yard line. But the wind was so incredibly strong that if they kicked it, they'd be lucky to kick it 25, 30 yards. Although I do think they obviously should have kicked it. If you remember, they went for it on 4th and 1, didn't make it, hit the 2-minute warning. They went for it on 4th down again. And I think it was the New York Post that had the great headline. It was Dumb and Dumber, which was classic. Wish I'd have thought of that when I was broadcasting the game. But it made no sense. So because if you made it at that time, well, then basically you just run out the clock and you go to overtime. If you don't make it, then you absolutely automatically lose the game, which the Cowboys did. But now that time has passed, to be somewhat fair, kicking the ball into that particular wind, where Mike Saxton would kick it, say, 45, 50 yards, he really would have been lucky to kick it about 25, 30 at the best, and Philadelphia probably still kicks the field goal to win the game. So there again, without question, the weather impacted the outcome of a game, and I just don't think that's right. It's understandable, and I do realize that I somewhat probably contradict myself when I say that I don't like weather impacting a game, but then again, it is part of the game because I like my games outdoors.
Well, there you go.
And I just like them outdoors in perfect weather, which, and it doesn't matter where anymore in the country.
Right.
That's always a crapshoot,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you can talk about home field advantage and that sort of thing. I always think about what is it like if a team from Texas or Arizona or California plays in a place like Green Bay or New York or wherever, where it's going to be colder. And I mean, I like cold weather, but I don't think anything could prepare me for something like the Ice Bowl or one of these other games.
No, the Ice Bowl, back in the day, I mean, that was the extreme example of it, obviously. But we even saw it in this past year in the NFL playoffs. Miami had to go north, and I'm trying to think, I think it was Buffalo. Had to go to Buffalo, and it's freezing temperatures. And you could just tell, I mean, the Miami players were trying to act tough. A couple of guys, didn't wear long sleeves, trying to show how tough they were. Weather it killed them. I mean, it killed the entire Miami team. There is something to be said for home field advantage, and I respect the Buffalo Bills for playing in that weather, the Green Bay Packers, and so on. But back to my main argument that when because the reverse of that is also true. When teams from the north would go to Miami, and the humidity and the heat would be somewhat of an advantage for the Dolphins, for example. But not nearly as bad as cold. I've always said, I don't know if you're the weather guy, you tell me, but I've always said that heat is uncomfortable. Cold hurts. Cold actually.
There's something to
that. There's pain. I've been in some remarkably hot conditions, and when the Cowboys were in Wichita Falls for training camp years ago, never seen anything that hot. I mean, it was just stupid hot.
Yeah.
And yet, I was there most every day. The Cowboys practiced every day. Incredibly uncomfortable. Now it can lead to pain if you're not careful. Dehydration and the like.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I can go out and play golf, or did when I was playing, and I didn't really care how hot it was. I mean, it would be incredibly uncomfortable, but I could play. On an incredibly cold day, no, I can't play now. Because my fingers hurt, my feet hurts, my face hurts.
Sure.
And that to me was always the difference between the hot and the cold.
Yeah, part of that is obviously the comfort level. A lot of that has to do, and I'll talk about this ad nauseum in the summer. A lot of that has to do with your body's ability to regulate its own temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what factors into that more so than just the temperature is the humidity.
Right.
Because on a really humid day, your body can't remove or release as much heat. Right. Whereas when it's a dry heat, as
the ever popular dry heat,
as Arizona like to talk about,
but there is something to that.
There is, because when you sweat, it's actually not the act of sweating that cools you off; it's the evaporation of that sweat. So people, when it's really, really, really humid, you're not in water. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. It maintains heat, so it's gonna hold the heat in. Yeah. So the more humid it is, the more you're sweating. It's counteracting. You're actually heating up. So when it's a dry cold, though, that wind goes right through you because there's no. That's essentially removing whatever heat you had.
Yeah.
And if there's no wind blowing, and you have a snowstorm or something where it's a little more humid, it's actually not that bad. But as soon as that dry wind hits you, it's killer.
The first time I ever heard that term dry heat, I was in Arizona many, many years ago.
Yep.
And we were going to play golf, and it was like 110. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, this is impossible. And this was before the temperatures had really started climbing, and it was an unheard of number. But it really wasn't all that bad. But then I've also played in Houston when it was like 89. Yeah. And I couldn't stand it. I couldn't get to the ninth hole refreshment stand fast enough because of just what you said. The temperature supposedly wasn't that hot, but the humidity was just suffocating. Yeah. And that's exactly right. But all of that, and again, it's part of life. It's part of what we have to deal with. I think even more so now over the last few years. The extreme changes that I think we're starting to see, unfortunately, on a more regular basis. But it is something that's going to have to be addressed. And I don't know that we're ever going to get to the point, at least in my former world, where every game is going to be played indoors. I think that's going to be the trend without question. Right. As new stadiums are being built, I think you'll see more and more dome stadiums. Which on the one hand, like I said, is probably good because it is the best environment. When you can go to a Rangers game last year and you see it in August, I mean, I did it for almost 35, 40 years of trying to cover a Rangers game in August is just brutal. Yeah. And the fans would not show up. Even when they were winning, the fan numbers were down. Yeah. Now you go to a Rangers game and it's 72 degrees. Mm-hmm. Prices are still too high, and a hot dog is ridiculous. But still, But I mean that's hard to argue with. I mean that's just hard to argue against the comfort of a fan watching a game, let alone how the players are able to perform because of the conditions. And I just think that's weather impacts again, everything we do in life.
Yeah.
But as an old, washed-up, has-been sportscaster, I hated it when it impacted the games that I was following.
Is there ever a time when the weather directly impacted your ability to cover a game, whether it was tech issues or something of that nature?
Oh, I'm sure there has been. I don't really. The number of times, and back to the cold primarily. Technical issues that actually shut us down, I don't recall any of those, but I know the preparations leading into covering a lot of games, even covering the Byron Nelson golf tournament was a chore.
Oh, yeah.
The guys out there with his cameras, the cameras, getting covered in rain, covering up the equipment, making a 10-pound, 20-pound project. Now it's like 40 pounds a year.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, all of that. I don't think we've ever, and I'm sure news reporters have out in the cold and the like. Does it have an impact? Absolutely. Did it ever really stop us from covering an event? No, we're kind of like the mailman.
Sure.
We got to go.
Yeah.
There back in the day. The cameras required a separate recorder. So I would be on the sideline carrying the recorder with my photographer. And thank goodness they got rid of that after a couple of years. But boy, I remember a lot of games where we're bundled up on that sideline and I've got this recorder strapped over my back and we're just freezing, just absolutely freezing. And yet, the mail had to be delivered. So we kept going.
Well, I've got one last question, and this is more, we'll kind of shift gears a little bit. This is more of a kind of a working in weather question, but you were at WFAA through what I saw as almost a paradigm shift when Troy Duncan stepped away, and of course Pete Delkus stepped into that role. So
I know you're a big fan of Pete.
Well, we have a difference.
The lovely Mrs. Hansen told me to gig you on that.
We definitely have a difference in style.
Yeah. I think the whole world has a difference in style.
Absolutely. Everybody has a different way of doing things, and whatever works for the station you're working for and the brand that you run. He's in a much different environment than I am, so I can't say he's right.
Well, that's kind of the key thing. I know one of the. I said this to Pete here. He started. I think he's doing like this 14-day forecast. Well, Harold Taft used to refuse. I remember. I'm old enough to remember when it went to 7-day forecast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Harold Taft wouldn't do it over Channel 5.
Yeah.
And said because basically there is no such thing. And I've argued with Troy. Troy did the 7-day, as I recall. I'm pretty sure he did the 7-day.
Yep.
And now Pete's doing a 14-day. And the reality is, you just can't. And I used to argue with Pete and Troy both that I used to throw this big summer party in Waxahachie, which you probably are familiar with. And I would be looking at that weather because it was in June, always the last weekend in June, which was kind of that make or break rain season. Sometimes it would be dry, sometimes. And so you get that 7-day forecast, and on Monday morning he says, it's going to be completely dry on Saturday, and at 3:30 Saturday afternoon it's pouring, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so I said to him, and I said to both of them at one time or another, I said, if I made as many mistakes broadcasting sports as you do trying to predict the weather, they would have fired me by the end of the month. And they looked at me, and Pete looks at me and said, well, why don't you start giving ball scores 4 to 5 days ahead of time and let's see how good you are. But it's true.
Point.
But I do. But and this is all kind of a sign of journalism, quite honestly, is that journalism of and by itself used to be a civic obligation. And then they figured out, and it's been 45, 50 years ago, they figured out that they could actually make money with this. It used to be the network said, well, in order to have our FCC license, we ought to probably do like some public service programming.
Sure.
And then they realized, Walter Cronkite's really popular and people really like to watch him. We can sell ads. Mm-hmm. And Tom Brokaw and Huntley and Brinkley. And then local television found out, boy, this is a gold mine in many cases. And then it became a product.
Yeah.
And just like any other business, it caters to its audience. And in our particular case of talking about weather, when an audience survey tells you that the audience wants a 14-day forecast, you can't really convince them that there is no such thing. So you do it. And I hate that. I mean, I don't know how Pete feels about it because they started that after I left. But the 7-day didn't bother me. I thought, okay, it's going to change, but maybe you can get some idea for whatever reason that's supposed to gain.
Sure.
But to me, watching how weather is presented many times on our newscast, all of them, is really just symptomatic of how news is presented nowadays. Sure. It's not presented as a public service anymore. It's presented as a product that they need to sell.
Right.
And it's not a whole lot different than the cars and the beer ads that come right along with it.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I remember when it was 5 days and then the bonus was 7 days, and then you went to 7 days and the bonus was 10.
Yeah.
And then you got AccuWeather app now going 45 days out, which is just
it's like reading the Farmer's Almanac. You know, I mean, I've heard people all day, I checked my Farmer's Almanac. And, it's going to be a quick spring. It's going to be a late winter. And please, I mean, that groundhog is about as good as most of it. You know, and, and the groundhog's never right.
Yeah.
But this is what's the fascination with weather that I still don't understand. As I'm sure you're well aware, local news is primarily driven by weather. Because the interest in weather, and it's an overriding interest. Yeah. Sports, for example, pales considerably to the interest of weather. Whether the weather's right or wrong doesn't really matter. Yeah. And whether they're overhyping it is another one of my pet peeves. Yeah. They overhype the potential, but it drives the audience like crazy. Yeah. Ed Bark wrote this in the Morning News years ago that if Channel 8 could just get some constant flooding, I mean, our ratings would just go through the roof.
Yeah.
Cowboys winning a Super Bowl would spike the ratings, and that's about it.
Right.
But when you look at what it has done, it just makes everything else have to fall in line. And I'm always intrigued by the fact, and this I think is a great example of that. What does they call it? What's his name?
Punxsutawney Phil?
Punxsutawney Phil.
Yeah.
I saw this story just the other day. He's only been right like 3 out of the last 11 years or something.
It's about 30%, yep.
Yeah. And yet it's a national event every year.
Uh-huh.
It's reported it's reported all over the country about this groundhog seeing his shadow or something. And then there's always this line, at least this is I think this is like the first year I've really heard this, but he's probably wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there going, but there's a national obsession with what we know is probably wrong. And I've argued this with Pete. I love Pete Delkus, by the way, just in case he happens to hear this. I do. I love Pete Delkus. But I've said this to him, so I'm not saying anything he hasn't heard.
Sure.
I'm constantly amazed at the obsession of local news with something that is probably wrong.
Right.
Doesn't mean they lied. Doesn't mean they did anything ethically wrong.
Right.
But it would be like, okay, Dale's going to predict now the final scores of all the games. Mm-hmm. If we made that our mantra, if we made that the lead, before we get started with today's news, Dale's here with the scores of this weekend's games.
Yeah.
That to me would be every bit as stupid.
Right.
No, they need me to come back Sunday night after the games are over.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And then I'm usually pretty accurate.
Yeah.
But that's the way I look at weather. The lead story on almost every local newscast, almost every single night, is weather, which may or may not be right.
Sure. Well, and it's never a perfect science, and
No.
I don't think it ever will be. And it's one of those things where we're in Texas, and I go around to a lot of schools, and we talk about the fact that Texas is perfectly positioned to get everything in wild variation.
Which is what I happen to like about it, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And it's one of the main things I do love about Texas is that coming from the north, I'm from the Midwest, but we had plenty of snow in Omaha. St. Cloud, Minnesota for 1 year was the worst year of my life, weather-wise. Went to work one day, it was 17 below zero with a wind chill of 73 below zero. Had 29 straight days where the high temperature was 2 below zero. So it's never cold. I don't even have a coat anymore. I mean, I've never had a cold day in Texas. I get over it. But, we have the fireplace going, but not a lot. We have the air conditioner going quite a bit. We do get the occasional sleet, ice, sometimes snow, but not for a long time.
Sure.
And I happen to enjoy it. It gets incredibly dry in the summer, and then usually we get too much rain in the spring and fall, maybe.
Yep.
But for the most part, I like it, because the reality is every place you go has got a trade-off. Used to be the argument of, well, go to San Diego, which might still be the best place weather-wise. But then they get hit with droughts, they get hit with monsoons now, flooding, mudslides, earthquakes.
Yeah.
Every place has something, and I am one of those people that believe that climate change is a real thing that's going to become a real problem going forward. And because I think now we just see extremes. And, I'm fascinated by, well, this was a record high temperature, breaking the record set in 2022. And this was a record rainfall, breaking the record set in 2021. I mean, really? I mean, it used to be, this was a record high temperature today, breaking the record set in 1906 or 1942. Or
Right.
And now the records seem to be almost in every category, breaking records that were set last year. And I don't think that bodes well for the future. But then I don't have many more years to worry about it, so I guess I'll be okay.
Well, Dale, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me. It was a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities to talk about other things, because you spent a long time doing a very interesting job. So thank you so much for watching, and looking forward to bringing more of these conversations with you. So stay tuned, and stick around, because the weather will change, and I'll bring you all the updates I can.